Just like to introduce our presenter for our program, the November program regarding the Moravians in Emmaus. I'd like to welcome Tom McCullough, who is the Assistant Archivist at Moravian Archives in Bethlehem. He was kind enough to put together our program, which is the first 100 years of Moravians in Emmaus. So if you could please just welcome Tom. Thank you.
Set up here. Everyone hear me okay? No? Hear me okay? Perfect. Okay, so thank you, Jeannie Harkle. Thank you, Emmaus Historical Society. Thank you, everyone, for having me out tonight, and thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure to be in Emmaus and presenting about Moravian history for the first time. Maybe I know a few of you before from helping you, doing some research on Emmaus history. You may just know me as the nerdy archivist who works in Bethlehem. I'm the guy who works with all the old records all the time. But it's a delight to see you in person if we've talked on the phone. My name is Tom McCullough. As was said, I'm the Assistant Archivist of the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem. I know it's getting late, I should say too, and this meeting starts at 7, so I'll try and keep you awake for the duration of my presentation. Let me know if I can clarify any slides that I go through. Today I'm going to talk about the first 100 years of Emmaus history. I'm going to start maybe before you would think I would start, in 1747. Emmaus just celebrated its 275th anniversary as a Moravian church congregation, but I'd like to go back 5 more years to when Moravian ministers were first really interacting with people in the area here, because I think it's important to focus on those early years as well. So I'm going from 1742 to 1842. I don't think I've been asked to speak today because I'm the expert on Emmaus Moravian history. In fact, there's probably some experts in this audience. I consider myself more someone who's privileged to work with the records from Emmaus Moravian Church especially, over time, and my role today, I hope, is to be able to show you some of the genres of records that we have at the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem where I work, and give you a sense of the types of records that are available, that if there's anything you find really interesting in today's presentation, you can kind of carry on the research and come to the archives and work with me there. Maybe there's some records that you could take a look at in person. The records from Emmaus are pretty unmatched when it comes to a pretty small colonial village. As I mentioned before, this community dates back to really around 1742. 1747 was the organization of the Moravian congregation in Emmaus. It wasn't called that at the time. We'll get to that. But there's an extensive documentary record for such a small village that by the middle of the 19th century had only 300 residents. So there are over 4 shelving units full of records from this community. It's pretty much unmatched unless you're comparing it to Bethlehem, Nazareth, or Lidditz, 3 other closed Moravian settlements. So really only those communities I know of in the Moravian Archives have generated as many records or have as many records about that community. Like I said, I'm privileged to work with these records every day. And in these first 100 years of Emmaus history, no less than 33 pastors, of course their names are too small for you to see here, but no less than 33 pastors were charged with overseeing the Moravian congregation in Bethlehem or coming here as itinerant pastors. So many people kept records, and the reason that I can go through them today and we can present this history is really because of the records they generated. So I'm thankful to all these pastors whose names are here as well. Every once in a while, my slides will load really slow, and that's because I use really big images, so you'll have to bear with me. Before we dig into the vast records that document the history of this town, I want to first acknowledge that we're on ancestral land of the Lenni Lenape and other Native American groups who refer to the specific region as Makunche, sometimes spelled with a K instead of a G, as you see here, meaning feeding place of the bears. This is in reference to the fertile soil in this region, the convergence of several waterways, so places where bears would feed, especially waterways like the nearby Little Lehigh Creek. You can imagine why that was an apt name for this location. One thing I found interesting when going through the records is a little bit about the geology of this region. There was a geology professor at, I believe, Lehigh University and maybe Muhlenberg named Richmond Myers, who was really interested in local topics, and one of them was geology of local communities. He wrote extensively about the limonite iron ores that are present in this region, a lot of jasper, clay. I'm familiar with South Mountain as a runner. I like to trail run every once in a while, and that's my only first-hand witnessing of that local area where you run up the mountain there. But to know that there's all of that iron ore deposited in that mountain too is pretty interesting. And it's one of the things that brought people to the area. Obviously there's really rich agricultural opportunities in the area as well. And there were at least a dozen iron ores, or iron mines, I should say, from here to Goff's Hill by the middle of the 19th century. Goff's Hill is about where Bolit restaurant is today, Sidersville Road. From here to Sidersville Road, there were at least 12 iron mines by 1850. So that says a little bit about, the geologic history of the region. So not just the people here. There are several hypotheses for how people first came into this region. I know from Preston Barba's They Came to Emmaus and some other really important works that people who came into this region who were colonial settlers are often described as squatters. Not everyone here had title to property in the area, especially not until after the walking purchase of 1737. Some of the early owners of land in this area, you'll be familiar with names like Sebastian Knaus and Jakob Ehrenhardt, Georg Ziegler. We could keep going, but there's a lot of these early landowners. And some of these people would eventually form the early founders of the Moravian Church in Emmaus. Here we see an image of the so-called shelter house, which was built in 1734. As far as I know, that might be one of the oldest structures that, if not the oldest structure that's still existent or extant in the in Lehigh County. If anyone knows of an earlier building than the 1734 shelter house, that would be, as far as I know, here in Emmaus, the oldest structure in Lehigh County. I think it is. It's pretty fascinating that here, one of my coworkers described as a very interesting location for someone to form a community. It's very densely forested in this area. When you just go right outside of Emmaus and all of a sudden you're in the woods and you're in these mountainous woods. So why would someone pick here to live? And I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have the answers for that, but it is interesting to see this early structure that was built here in 1734 that people could use for refuge, whether they were coming through visiting or trading. Yeah. So, you see on this right here, this is a travel map from the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. This is one of the early maps that was used by Moravian ministers coming through the area, and there they actually used the word Magunche to refer to this region. You can't see it, but it's above the word Pennsylvania, which is written right there in the middle. So that word was used pretty early, and it was almost used interchangeably with Salzburg or Salisbury Township today, and Macungie Township are in no way related to the names that they were using at the time. It's a little confusing if you are familiar with Macungie, Pennsylvania. I think that was called Millerstown for the longest period of time, and it had nothing to do with Emmaus, other than the fact that it's the same Lenape word, Macungie, meaning feeding place of the bears. But yeah, before we get into Emmaus Moravian history, it's important that we think about Moravian history in general. How do the Moravians end up in Pennsylvania? So I'm going to click through here. Before I do, I just wanted to force this slide in here tonight. I think this is really interesting. This is a road from Bethlehem through Emmaus in two separate maps that we have in the collection. It's really neat. It shows all the stopping points that a Moravian itinerant pastor would have made. It might be too difficult to see, but right here is where you have Macungie Township, and you have Jakob Ehrenhardt's property right here. You have Tobias's mill, and I think Tobias was one of the early founders of the Moravian Church as well. It starts up here and works its way to the right in two separate maps. So what brought the Moravians to this area? So the Moravians, we're probably familiar with a little bit of Moravian history. The Moravian Church was founded in Kunwald in 1457 by founders of the Czech martyr Jan Hus, or John Huss, as you might know more in anglicized fashion. Hus was burned at the stake in 1415, and you see this depiction here of Jan Hus being burned at the stake after the trial at the Council of Constance. The Bohemian Reformation didn't end with the martyrdom of Jan Hus. Rather, the particular group of adherents who said that they were followers of Jan Hus organized in 1457 and called themselves the United Brethren. In Czech, they called themselves Janata Bratrska, and in German, it's the Böhmischen or Mährische Brüder, or Bohemian Brethren or Moravian Brethren. The word Moravian is actually pronounced Moravian in Europe, but we say Moravian here. So these Moravians were in the Czech Crown lands, which for a long period of time were a difficult place to practice any religion other than what the state organized religions were. And in Czech Crown lands, that was the Catholic Church. So a lot of Protestants kind of went into private worship in their homes and were referred to often as like the hidden seed, people who were worshiping in private. And it wasn't until after the 30 Years' War in the 17th century that a number of individuals reorganized and came to the estate of Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf in Saxony. So Zinzendorf was born in 1700, died in 1760. He was a Saxon nobleman, trained as a lawyer. He was Lutheran from birth. And when refugees from Moravia and Bohemia came to settle on his property, along with some people from Poland, the Schwenkfelder, you might be familiar with the Schwenkfelder who also came to Pennsylvania. With these three groups on his property, they found religious asylum there beginning in the 1720s. They formed a community that they called Herrnhut, the Lord's Watch. So where that is the three-country corner of Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic. I said that I run. I had wanted to run from Germany into Poland into the Czech Republic when I was there a month ago, and I didn't do it. But you can see how close everything is there, just north of Prague in the Czech Republic. So in that little piece that juts down into the Czech Republic is what we call the Dreiländereck, Eck, or the three-country corner. This is where the Moravians from the modern-day Czech Republic and from Poland came and settled on the state of Zinzendorf. From there, they founded the community of Herrnhut, which you see on your right. It doesn't look a whole lot different today. It's still a pretty quaint village there. And from Herrnhut, it was decided in 1732, or really in 1731, to start sending missionaries out around the world. And in doing so, Moravians sent missionaries to the Caribbean. They first sent missionaries to the Danish West Indies, which are today's U.S. Virgin Islands. So St. Thomas was the first place Moravians sent missionaries. In 1732, two missionaries went there, Leonard Dober and David Nitschmann. Here you can see a depiction of Moravians kind of taking pride in converts from different areas of the world. Some of them would include from the Danish West Indies. You heard me mention the Danish West Indies, today's U.S. Virgin Islands. There is another Emmaus of the Moravian Church in St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands. It's pronounced Emmaus, not Emmaus. There was an Emmaus in Niski, Germany of the Moravian Church. It was the boarding school for girls or young deaconesses, was also called Emmaus. And there was also a Moravian community in South Africa called Emmaus at one point. So you can see this is not the first time the Moravians will use this name, and we'll get back to the biblical references to Emmaus soon. So one of the main efforts of the Moravians in coming to North America When they eventually decided to do so, they sent missionaries to Georgia in 1735. They were unsuccessful with their mission in Savannah to the Creek American Indians, and decided to come north to the Lehigh Valley, first coming to Skippack, Pennsylvania in 1736. There they met a man named Henry Antes, and Henry Antes invited the Moravians to live with him, and he also came to inspect the land in Nazareth with the Moravians in 1740. And that's sort of how the Moravians get their start in the Lehigh Valley. They first organized at Nazareth, Pennsylvania in 1740. They're kicked off the property in 1741. So they find another piece of land, and that's how they end up in Bethlehem. In 1741, April 2nd, 1741, they purchased the property in Bethlehem. And that's their first 500-acre tract that the Moravians own. So it's their first foothold in proselytizing in this area. I mentioned that they came to preach to Native American groups. That was their primary goal in Pennsylvania. But one of the things that I think Preston Barba points out really well in They Came to Emmaus is that Pennsylvania had over 13,000 German speakers by the 1730s, and very few full-time pastors. There were a lot of empty pulpits. A lot of churches had been built in Pennsylvania, but it was really difficult for a small workforce of pastors representing the Reformed Church and the Lutheran Church to actually make it to a lot of these locations. So Moravian pastors, often being themselves raised or reared in Reformed or Lutheran traditions, probably identified very well with people that they preached to in these regions. You can see some of the preaching circuits. Emmaus is on there in the middle of this map from 1750. And on the left is the first pastor who came to Emmaus, Gottlieb Petzold, or Betzold, in 1742. Any questions while this is happening? Okay. So, Zinzendorf did come to this area in 1742. I'm pretty sure he preached on the property of, not Knaus, but another gentleman whose name is signed here. And it was decided a few years later, Zinzendorf made a really strong impression on the people there in Macunche, that itinerant pastors would start being sent to Emmaus, or start being sent to Macunche, my apologies. And it was so successful that by 1746, the residents of Macunche and Saucona, which is Saucon Township today, petitioned the Moravian Church in Bethlehem to send a full-time pastor there and to organize a Moravian congregation. So here you can see the names of some of those people. You have Martin Bamberger, Bastian Knaus. He went by Bastian, not really Sebastian very often. Peter Graf is at the bottom. The interesting thing here too is that it's also signed by all the women in the congregation, which is a little bit unusual for a petition at this time, so I think that's awesome. And one of the things that eventually happened is the church would be built on this property just north of Jakob Ehrenhardt, or the first church. But church ministering was not the only thing that was done in Emmaus. There was also a lot of early Moravian education in the area. This is not the earliest school at Emmaus. That building was long knocked over, but it is a school that was still there at the end of the 19th century, so I think it's a nice picture to go with this. But what we have here are the list of the names of those who helped build the schoolhouse, the first schoolhouse that was in Emmaus. These are the types of records that are there in the archives. And here we see the names Jakob Ehrenhardt, Bastian Knaus, Martin Bamberger, Rauschenberger, Albrecht, Loescher, Betzel, Köhler, Graf, Weber, Bitz, Bollinger, Motzer, Hartmann, Kratzer, Motz, Knaus, Kopp, Böhringer, Pfingsthal, Solomon Jennings, which is interesting. Solomon Jennings was one of the runners in the walking purchase in 1737, so it's interesting to see that he was there helping build this property, or this school.
You know, Where that building was?
Where this building was, it does have a caption on it at the Moravian Archives. I can look into that, and
Okay.
I'll give you my card
I
afterwards.
was curious where it is.
Yeah, I think it does actually say in the caption. So, one thing I wanted to mention too about early Magunshi is that this congregation that was here in this area was yoked with another congregation. So there was a place called Alamengel, that was in Lynn Township, Pennsylvania. Alamengel kind of refers to the opposite of what Magunshi referred to, all barren, nothing fertile. So very different agricultural climate there apparently. But on the right here you see Alamengel. This is from the 1750s. This ink wash, and on the left here we have Salisbury, which was what used interchangeably with Magunshi to refer to the Moravian congregation here. That's also from the 1750s. Just to give us a sense of what it looked like, very, very rural here in 1750s Magunshi. I decided, because I thought it wouldn't be so interesting just to tell you when this building was built in 1766 and when this building was built in 1834, that it might be interesting to look at things through time by focusing on just a random family that lived in Emmaus. So this was totally random. I went to the church register from Emmaus, went to 1842, looked for people who died in that year, and I found someone named Ludwig Christ. And you can see him right here. He died in 1842, and I thought he might make a good subject to follow back through time. What did he experience when he lived here? What buildings might he have been in? It's more interesting to me, and I think a lot of people who enjoy history today, to know about what life was like and what it was like for people, and it's easier to imagine it through the lens of a person. So I can see from here, Ludwig Christ was born in Emmaus, when it was called Emmaus. His father was from that nearby community of Lynn Township, as you can see. His mother was from Salisbury Township, married in Emmaus, so she was from the same exact town, it just had a new name by the time she was married. And we can see how he's connected with another family, Thomas Everett and Ludwig Andries at the top. They worked their way to Christ. We'll come back through all them through time. Okay, all right. So the first thing I wanted to start with was Katharina Andries being born in Magunshi in 1757. This is what typical church records look like from Emmaus. We have here in 1757 it was a Wednesday, that little symbol here, that zodiac symbol means Wednesday, the 20th of July. Wurde unseren Societätsglieder Ludwig und Sophia Andres' erstes Töchterlein geboren. So our society members, Ludwig and Sophia Andries' first infant daughter was born. And they have, when she was baptized in the public ceremony, the public service, that is how the entry continues. And here we have all the witnesses at her baptism. And this isn't a baptism in Emmaus that we see on our left, but it's kind of neat that we can see what a Moravian baptism would have looked like. We have some illustrations from our collection that show the baptism of a children from a Moravian perspective, the baptism of a child. So we can start to picture what this might have looked like in Emmaus' first worship space. Eventually, there are changes in land ownership in Emmaus. We know from the records that Jakob Ehrenhardt and Sebastian Knaus in 1758 decide to gift their property to the Moravian Church. They have a ton of property in Emmaus, and it results in the creation of a congregational village. From 1758 through 1761 is when the transition takes place. Here you can see just one of many maps in our collection that show this lot system. The nice thing about it is that they made these lot maps every couple of years so we can see the changes in who owned what properties and who were staying in certain properties. The reason that I picked this one, it's the blurriest, but it's the only one that shows Andrews. So the Andrews family, they lived in one of these early first 6 lots that are just to the left of this green space here. So they're somewhere in one of those 6 lots, but the numbers are actually so blurry on the original that I can't tell which property they lived in.
Lot
But-
6.
Yep, I think they're in lot 6. Oh, yes, okay, they're in lot 6.
The numbers on the map, that's the problem.
Okay, yeah, I think they're in lot 6. Okay. I know that there's a material culture expert here in the audience, and I'm not doing this for his sake, but it's inspired me to think about like what objects were in the community that people would have seen when they were here. You know, it's not just people, but what are the things that they used in their daily life? What tools did they use? And I think that's one of the cool things about the records is we can actually get a description of the types of objects, furniture in buildings, tools that would have been used in the community. So what I have here on the right-hand side is a description of all the contents that were in the Salzburg or Mogunshi Gemeinhaus or Congregation House. It was the first worship space. In 1758, this is a listing of all the objects that were in there, which is really cool. It's a couple pages long. It begins with bed linens and all sorts of different things that would be in a bedroom. It then goes on to wooden objects that you'd see. Holzorgeräte, and there you see things like 4 foot washing vessels. So Moravians had foot washing services, so you can start to picture that there were 4 little buckets made of wood or cask that could be used for foot washing services, where someone would wash the feet of someone else in the congregation. So that tells us a little bit about the worship style. One thing that's cool, and it's still something that happens in Moravian churches today, is there's a liturgist table. This is a Moravian church in Kleinwelke, Germany. Not Emmaus. However, this is the type of tapestry, or this cloth, this green cloth, and the liturgist table are both referenced on this inventory, meaning they use the same exact cloth that Moravian churches still use today around the world. This type of green cloth at the communion table or liturgist table. So that's kind of interesting to me that hasn't changed in 250 years. We still see that. We also see things like baking trays. I don't know if they were for love feast buns or for cooking in the congregation, but it's really interesting to see the different types of objects that there are. One thing that I think is pretty cool is how did they get light in a church? I mean, we're lucky we could come in here and there are lights that we can turn on, but they had 4 sconces on the wall in the first worship space. They also had an old chandelier. They describe it as old here. They also had brass candles that would sit on the communion table up front. There were 2 of them. So just little details like that are kind of fun that we can actually reconstruct what the space might have looked like, even though that building is long gone. And this would be the same building where little Katerina would have been baptized in the 1750s. So it's kind of just neat to be able to reconstruct that. It's also in that worship space where Ludwig and Sophia Andrews became members in 1761 of the Moravian Church. They're my time travelers that I picked to kind of follow through time here. We could see how they were received on Sunday in 1761, Sunday Epiphany. They were received as members of the Moravian Church through Brother Nybert, the pastor. And the reason that I show this is it was not easy at the time to be granted membership to the Moravian Church. Even though Katerina had been born and baptized, their daughter, 4 years earlier, the parents were not considered full members until 4 years later. So just because their child was baptized in 1757, they were still not accepted as members until 1761. And that was one rung of Moravian membership in the 18th century. Obviously, communion, as we'll see, would be another step in membership in Moravian Church. Here we can see on the right another illustration of what it might have looked like at a service and reception, where someone would be received as a member of the church here in the 18th century through the kiss of peace, or the right hand of fellowship. There would be two ways in which that would happen. So Emmaus was eventually named in 1761. I've used the name Emmaus a lot already, so it's a bit anachronistic. But Emmaus didn't get this name until 1761, and it did so on April 3rd, 1761. Joseph Spangenberg, or August Gottlieb Spangenberg, Moravian bishop, came from Bethlehem here to Emmaus, and he named the community in the 16th stanza of a 24-stanza song. So he had already picked it out. But because this community was reorganizing as a congregational village, a closed settlement, it seemed apt for Spangenberg at the time to give it a new name. Like Bethlehem and Nazareth, also biblical locations. He writes, he says, Als Jesus auferstanden war, reist von Jerusalem ein Paar der Jünger hin nach Emmaus. Sie waren ebenso zu Fuß. Da kannte denselben Weg sein Mann und hörte ihre Reden an. Ich sprach, darf ich euch wohl fragen, was euer Reden wohl besagen? So, not that. Vielen Dank. So, one of the things, as Jesus resurrected, he from Jerusalem traveled a pair, a couple, not a couple of disciples, on their way to Emmaus. Emmaus was the pronunciation for Germans in the 18th century. Emmaus. 3 syllables. Not Emmaus, not Emmaus, but Emmaus. And he heard their discussions, and he asked them what they were talking about, and so forth. But that's not so much the important verse. The 16th stanza is the really important verse, where he says, Now here we build a village small, towards its completion we give all. Here too our hearts within shall flame, Emmaus then shall be its name. If you're from the area, you probably know a bit about the name of the town, how it originally had 2 M's in the name, and then it lost an M at some point. But I think it's good to show here a few things. So on the right, you see Emmaus, written with 1 M and a flat line over it. The flat line in 18th century German means double me. But not everyone knew that, and that kind of gets lost to time, and not everyone was always so good about doing it. So what you have there is eventually people forget that meaning, and you have Emmaus written just E-M-A-U-S instead of E-M-M-A-U-S. Here I think is interesting regarding the pronunciation. Vogel ist nicht vor Emmaus, kann aber Erlaubnis haben, nach Antlitz sich anzubauen. Focal is not really good to send to Emmaus. They're talking about sending a particular person to Emmaus. But, it makes more sense to allow him to build in Lidditz. So these are Moravians discussing where this person will go. But the more interesting thing for me is how they're pronouncing Emma. They write Emmaus. Emmaus with an H in there. So that might say something about how they were pronouncing it in 1761. Emmaus. Maybe with 3 syllables? Yeah, good question. The debate continues. Our traveler through time eventually greets that. A synod in Lidditz. I want to show this document to show the interconnectedness of Moravian churches in the 18th century. Not only did pastors go to and from Moravian communities, but people would go to and from Moravian communities. Lidditz, for example, I just mentioned. Some people might apprentice in Lidditz. They might work in a trade that is already taken up in Bethlehem or Nazareth or Emmaus, and it might make more sense for them to go to another community where they can work on their own accord and not interfere with the trade of someone else. Moravians were really interconnected and would move around a lot and marry Moravians from other congregations. Here we have a greeting in 1761, just after this town was named and became a closed congregational settlement. We have a greeting from its residents to the synod of Moravian delegates that were organizing as they regularly did, in Lidditz, Pennsylvania. What's kind of neat is that even though he just became a member, Ludwig Andries, his name is right in the middle on the left side. And the cool thing is we can see how everyone actually signs their name, because you don't too often get to see people writing their own names in 18th century documents. It's usually a court or someone talking about them, anglicizing their name, and we have no idea how they spelled their name or wrote it. So this is kind of neat to see here. As you can see, Matthias Würsters, I'm sure his name, we would never spell it that way, but we see how it's spelled right there. Yeah. In 1775, Gerhard Christ marries a daughter. So Gerhard Christ is our next subject in this saga. He marries Katarina Andries, who we learned about being baptized in 1757, and he does so in the church that was renovated in 1766. So this is the 1749 church here that had an addition put on in 1766 because it had gotten too small. So that says something about the growth of the congregation. So it was in that building there that we see on the right that Gerhard Christ and Katarina Andries got married in 1775. And here is a record of their marriage. And Pastor Andreas Langard carried out the marriage ceremony.
Where is Saul?
The Zal?
S-A-L?
Oh, yeah, good question. The Zal means worship hall, or hall or worship space. One of the issues with 18th century Emmaus is that the Moravians used the terms Schulhaus, Gemeinhaus, Saal interchangeably. They all refer to the same building. The schoolhouse, the Gemeinhaus, and the Saal were all the worship space. It might have also functioned as a school, Schulhaus, but it's really confusing that they use different terms all to refer to the same building. But Saal means hall or worship space in German. So it's actually in a lot of Moravian congregations, they still refer to the Saal as the sanctuary where people go and worship. In some Moravian congregations, the Saal was a smaller space within the same church. So in Central Moravian Church, if you've ever been to the large Moravian Church in Bethlehem, there's a small Saal upstairs that is separate. It's a smaller chapel. So chapel is also a good translation for Saal. In the upper space of Central Moravian Church in Bethlehem. Yeah. What happened 2 years after that marriage? The homestead of Heinrich Knaus was built. I love this picture because it's one of the earliest photographs I know of from Emmaus. So for me, this is really cool to see. I don't know if this building still stands.
Yes.
It does? Okay. That's fantastic. So this is pretty cool. One of the early photographs of it here. Yeah.
That's the
Canals Home.
Yeah, Canals Homestead. Yeah, overall.
I list here 12 people who served from Emmaus in the Continental Army or the Continental Militias during the American Revolution. The reason this is really interesting is because Moravians had a stance on pacifism. They were conscientious objectors, and they were granted that privilege by Continental Congress in 1775. Soon after the war broke out in 1775, Emmaus organized a committee of safety, public safety, which is pretty interesting for a community. That's how organized the Moravians were here. And one of the things that Moravians were not willing to do in the 18th century were swear oaths, or take oaths before a magisterial court or so. And they were allowed to get by that by doing something else instead, but not by swearing an oath. Eventually, 18 Moravians were arrested. Actually 20 were sanctioned or called to come to Easton for trial. And 19 of them were arrested, including Andreas Giering, whose petition is here to the judge to be released. This is pretty interesting because almost everyone who was imprisoned for somewhere upwards of, I think, 11 months between 1777 and 1778, 12 of them eventually served in continental militias. So even though that early conviction was not to serve in the military in any capacity, 12 of those 19 men, actually served in the continental militias. And it's pretty well known about which 12 men they are. If you go to the Old God's Acre on Adrian Street, Adrian Street, you'll actually see markers for those 12 Revolutionary War veterans. And one of them is, of course, Georg Christ, who we saw marrying Katerina just a few slides ago. We also see some other familiar names. Ludwig Andries, who was born in Mogunshi in 1734. So it's kind of interesting how these people keep coming up through time. Speaking of how they come up through time, there are thankfully very detailed membership catalogs in the Moravian archives in Bethlehem. The Moravians were obsessed with making church censuses. They did so every year for some congregations. Some they do every 4 years. Emmaus, it's a lot. I wish they kept better catalogs in the 1740s. They're very scant for Emmaus then, but after that, they're really detailed. And one of the things that we see in this membership catalog this is a 1779 membership catalog. It's updated as things change with people. But we see Georg Christ and Katerina under number 16 here. And if we go all the way to the right, we see that he works as a cobbler, a shoemaker, or a shoester. That's interesting because his soon son-in-law is also a shoester, or the uncle of his, anyway. A future family member that he doesn't know about yet is not going to be allowed to come to Emmaus, I find, in 1788 because there's already a cobbler working in Emmaus. And it just so happens to be him is the reason, because there's no reason for him to compete with the trade of this shoester that already works in Emmaus. It's a very controlled Moravian congregational village. The lots are controlled by the church. Who comes and works in different trades is controlled by the church. And if there was already a baker, let's say, in the community, there was no need for another baker, and that person might be recommended to go to another community or work in a trade that they were not used to. Maybe they could be a little bit flexible with their skill set and use their skills to work in another trade. If we look down just a few, at the very bottom here, there's Johannes Ehrenhardt. This is, I believe, a son of Jakob Ehrenhardt. He is excommunicated from the community. He's a smith, and he is, or I don't know if he's excommunicated, but he moved into the world. And this is a Moravian way of saying that the closed community was not really for him. For whatever reason, he moved into the world. And for all we know, he might have moved back into the Moravian world by the next membership catalog. And that's what's kind of neat to see, is maybe that changes in the 1784 catalog. Maybe he's listed again as a church member. Here we see Ludwig Christ being born from Georg Christ. As I mentioned, Georg and Katerina got married in 1775, and here is the birth of their son Ludwig, who dies in 1842, that 100th anniversary. So finally, he's born, and how detailed are the Moravians? He is born on the 9th of June, 1785, on a Thursday in the evening, around 7 p.m. So they're very detailed about when someone was born. It's nice that we can know around 7 p.m. someone was born. And we see that when the child was baptized, it was on Sunday through Lawrence Baga, or Baggy, a Moravian pastor, and the witnesses to the baptism were Andreas and Katerina Geering. Andreas was a founding member of the community, and Brother Heinrich Bauer. Can you believe there was not a really functional general store in Emmaus until 1787? Someone was granted some permission in the 1760s to operate a small store, but it was a short-term lease, and it didn't last very long. Only the congregation had the privilege to operate a store, so it was kind of fascinating that in the 1760s they let someone do it for 3 years. It just didn't last very long, so the first full-time store came up in 1787. James Gill from Nazareth came here. He applied for permission to open up a store in Emmaus. And the interesting thing is here he's writing to the person who will replace him in the store in 1794. So he's writing here from Emmaus to Christian Heckewelder, brother of John Heckewelder, the famous Moravian missionary who served in Ohio and other places. Christian Renatus Heckewelder is writing to him here. And in 2 years, Christian Renatus will be in Emmaus working at this general store. Does anyone know where this is downtown?
Yeah,
right across the church.
right at
Yep,
Keystone
yep.
in
I
Maine.
think it was the post office too, for a number, maybe till 1803. It was the post office. Kind of somber. Moving on to the end of the 18th century, in 1799, the first original settler in Emmaus, in the Emmaus community, dies. And that is Anna Katerina Knaus, born Transu. So here we have her memoir, and this is a really interesting genre in the Moravian archives. From Emmaus, I know there's at least 120 memoirs that we have. And they're handwritten memoirs that were written by people in the community. They tell us a lot about spiritual life, much less about someone's like secular life and things that they did. Often they don't even mention how many if people had children. They're really focused on people's inward spiritual journey. And here we have one that's 4 pages from one of the founding members. So this kind of is a good way to signify that there was a changing of a guard too. The last original inhabitant in the Emmaus village dies in 1799, and we start to see a lot of things change in the beginning of the 19th century. Too far?
Yeah, you went too.
I'm not sure how to get back, but I'll walk up to it. Okay. I mentioned the God's Acre on Adrian Street. Here you can actually see a modern view of that. It's really interesting, the signage out front. It might have been done pretty long back, but some of the font is not really the 19th century fraktur. But it says Selig sind die Toten, blessed are the dead, and it continues on with the phrase there. Here you can see a photograph of the God's Acre. This is the old God's Acre from the 19th century. And Katerina Christ, born in 1757, finally passes away in 1819. And just like her fellow Emmaus resident, who died in 1799, has a 3 or 4 page memoir that is handwritten in German and talks a lot about her life as a member of the Moravian Church. Yeah. In between the new church being built, there was a pretty big financial crisis, especially in England in the 1820s. The Panic of 1825 was huge, and it's something that people here wrote about. One of the things that I think is really indicative of the changing of life that is much more controlled by church leadership is that people in Emmaus petitioned their church council, or their church committee, I should say, in 1825, saying that they feel that there should be a reduction in the pastor's salary. And it's part of it is brought out by the fact that in 1825 there was a financial crisis. But this is really unheard of, I think, that they want to reduce the pastor's salary by $133.33 to $100. Very specific, but that's sort of reflective of the financial issues, but also of the fact that this was a changing community, and people could not, be fully dictated by the requirements of a closed settlement. It was not only a problem affecting the residents, but it was also something affecting the Moravian Church in general. In 1820s and 1830s, we know from Bethlehem history that Bethlehem is not incorporated until, Bethlehem and Nazareth are not incorporated until the 1840s and 1850s. And part of that is they need to liquidate a lot of their properties. The church owned all the properties, but you can't necessarily always make money off of the properties that you own, and sometimes you can make more money by just selling them to other people. And that was something that happened here in Emmaus. The church still owned all the properties in the 1830s, and that's really their only transition out of the closed communal village settlement from 1761. Is in the 1830s, there's no hard and fast way when they say that the communal system is over, or the congregational village setup is over, but they do start to sell off church properties, and they ask for permission to do so. They also decided to do something really expensive, build a new church in 1834. They decided to do it in 1833, and that required doing a lot of canvassing. They raised $700 from the congregation, but they also raised, I believe, $600 by visiting Nazareth and Bethlehem and Shennick, 3 different Moravian communities. And they appointed 4 different people to go to different nearby communities that had a lot of non-Moravians and talk about it as what a benevolent cause it would be to support the building of a church. So I think another $500 was raised by 4 members who went around to areas like Saucon Township. One area that they didn't go to, I think, was near Hellertown. And the reason that they actually talk about why they're not going to go to certain areas, but it's fascinating how other things are influencing where they go to raise money. Another church was being built in Hellertown, so they thought it's a bad time to ask for people for money right now, because the people in that community need to help support the building of that church. So, and here we see 2 different images of the church. I think the one on the right is from the 1960s. The one on the left is from the 19th century. The interesting thing is, obviously, you can see that the belfry has changed quite a bit in between the 2 images. I know that was a big subject of controversy when Paul Poiker, my supervisor, spoke in Emmaus Moravian Church a few years ago. I remember the congregation laughing about Paul reading through the minutes and people arguing about how the belfry would be built, and that it was too ostentatious, that it would be renovated in such a way. But people kind of got a kick out of that, because people still argue about these things today. And it was interesting to see in the 1840s or 1850s people kind of arguing about how the belfry designs were too ostentatious. Also, what we have on the right to the church there is the chapel. I'm just going to click. And in that same church would be where Ludwig Christ, our subject who I mentioned, being born in the 1780s, marrying Everett. He married a daughter in the Everett family. So he married someone whose father wasn't allowed to come to the community because his father was a shoester. So it's interesting he married someone from another community. But he died in 1842, and his burial is right here in 1842. I just picked him at random to follow him through time in Emmaus. You can see on the right what the church would have looked like around the time of his death. Not a lot has changed in that picture from 1834 to 1842. You might be asking, where is the first public school? I just showed you that same image, but I think this is relevant because the functions of buildings change a lot. The Moravian Day School was in this building right here on the right, which we think is the parsonage. It is the parsonage, but it was the Moravian Day School, as far as I know, from 1834 until it became the first site of the first public school, and it was used until 1891 as the first public school. That was something that a lot of communities were doing in the 1840s, the introduction of public schooling in Pennsylvania. The last few things I want to show are just some nice watercolors that we have in our collection from Rufus Grider. Rufus Grider actually lived here in Emmaus. He's a pretty well-known Moravian artist. He was a collector. He collected objects in the 19th century, which was really unusual, everyday objects, but a very fascinating person. And one of the things I'm really appreciative of when it concerns Rufus Grider is that he painted a lot of structures or made illustrations right before they were raised. And otherwise there would be no way to know what some of those places might have looked like or start to visualize. Photographic technology is really developing in the 1840s, and it's not at a point where people can go outside and take easy photographs in a community. So the fact that he painted these scenes, these are all 1846 and 1847. Maybe you know where they are in Emmaus? I know this is, on the right is Daniel Keck's house is there, and Dr. Wilson's barn is back there. Here's another Rufus Grider image. This one I was able to find. Maybe you can determine what corner that would have been on. But this one you can determine pretty easily because there's an 1839 lot map and the person's name is identified who was in the structure on the corner. So, long story short, there's a lot of interesting history in the first 100 years of Emmaus. I thank you all for listening tonight. This is my first time talking about Emmaus. I usually am asked to talk about Moravian history in Bethlehem or Nazareth or genealogy or church records. So it's something completely new for me. And if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, or suggestions, I'm always happy to hear them. And thank you for coming out tonight.